I'm Lenny Lasater, and I was born in 1957, April of 1957, and I have a birthday coming up on Friday.
Yes, happy
Thank
birthday,
you.
darling. I'm
Yeah,
so happy you were
Aries,
born.
Butch, lesbian. I was born in Northwest Tennessee, and Tennessee is long, skinny state. So Northwest Tennessee is about 110 miles north of Memphis. 5 miles from the Kentucky state line south and about 20 miles east of the Mississippi River. So right up in that corner above Memphis. And that's where I grew up. I was the oldest of just two. My younger brother was born when I was 7, I believe. Yeah. And mom and dad were very active at Second Baptist Church. And I spent a lot of time there. My father was a church organist. And mom, taught Sunday school and played the piano, and lots of music in my family and my upbringing, singing, piano lessons, choir. And the church was big because we were always there. And so lots of music. I loved the music and the passion. And that would be sort of the thing that I got caught up in, was the energy of the music in the church and how that kind of would wash over you. And I did get saved and I got baptized and all that stuff, but I was very young when that happened. But again, I was in the church all the time. So pretty early on, I thought, okay, I'm going to die and go to hell if I don't get saved. So they had indoctrinated me pretty well. So let's see here. I was not out then in high school. I was pretty, I think I was a little bit boy crazy, but mostly because I liked the stuff that boys had, their cars and their hobbies and their knives and Harley Davidsons and motorcycles. And yeah, so I liked guy stuff a lot. So I had access to them because I was, I was I was younger and long hair, yeah. And I would date guys with really like hot rods so I could make them let me drive.
Yep.
And I remember this one guy, he had this big white Chevrolet Impala, and the speedometer went all the way to 120 miles an hour. And I would lay that
Oh,
speedometer down,
good.
baby. And this was before seatbelts or anything. And he would just sit over there and white knuckle. And one night he goes, if we had a wreck at this speed, or he said, if we had a blowout, a tire blowout at this speed, it would be a catastrophic event. And I went, do you have bad tires? And he said, no. And I said, well, then don't fucking say that. Don't do that. And don't you ever show up here with bad tires either, mister. But yeah. So yeah. And I had some early boyfriends were kind of jerks. Um, and the first real boyfriend I had was physically abusive. And I just right away that kind of set me up for, okay, they're fun to play with, but yeah. And I left high school after my junior year. I got to fly up like a brownie. I skipped my senior year because I'd taken enough classes or whatever to graduate, and I took senior English that summer, and I started at University of Tennessee, Martin,
Hello.
West Tennessee. I went from my junior year in high school to my freshman year in college, which was wonderful. I was 17, and I was finishing up with my boyfriends, and that last one, well, he wasn't officially the last one. He was the last real serious one who got kind of physically abusive. That really helped me again, push me over into this reckoning of, I'm not that excited about this. And I had already had feelings, and in fact, everybody thought I was a lesbian because I was so butch. I was always, even with the long hair, I was always sports and all kinds of stuff that were kind of butchy things. And I think I kind of have a butch attitude. I mean, hell, I'm a butch. I'm a stone butch, for Christ's sake, even when I was a girly girl. But so I came out that I guess around my freshman year, when or the end of my freshman year. So I would have been around 18 when I came out. And yay, that was great. I then went to
Tell more about that.
coming out.
Yeah, where did it happen? When did it happen? Who was she? How did you feel?
It was at the University of Tennessee, Martin.
Yeah.
I had gone to Memphis to see Leon Russell in concert. I came back and this was my drinking days. I came back and I was so drunk I was on the third floor. I knew I couldn't make it up to my room. So I found my friend Mildred on the first floor and knocked on the door and was like, "Can I crash here?" And she said, sure. She didn't have a roommate. They had two single beds on either side of the dorm room with, the bed, the closet, and the desk, one big solid piece of furniture, and then a window. So she was sleeping, and then I got in this other bed, and then she just kept, well, you just can't sleep with me. I don't, and I'm like, fine, yeah. I wanted to pass out, and then she somehow got me to get in bed with her. And then she said, well, now we're not going to do anything. And I'm like, fine. I'm drunk. I want to pass out. Can we just go to sleep? And then she just kept telling me what wasn't going to happen, which was really trying to initiate me, but I wasn't able to make the first move because I was intoxicated and I hadn't ever made love to a woman before. So somewhere in the night, I decided to let's give this a shot. I mean, I think we started kissing a little bit and petting a little bit, and she was this beautiful woman of color, full-figured gal, and I mean, it was wonderful. I mean, just touching her and kissing her was like, this is much better. This is so much better. And
Did you know she likes women?
no, no, no.
Oh,
I was her first. I was her first
oh my goodness, both of
anybody.
you together.
She was a
Oh,
virgin. She had never had sex with men or women. I had
wow.
sex with men, but not with women. So yeah, that night was funny. Can I tell a little, well,
Yes.
it was the first time I'd made love to a woman. And of course, I immediately knew that I wanted to have oral sex with her. And so, as I said, she was a robust woman, and I was a little skinny kid back then. And I climbed down and began to have oral sex, and she kind of leapt up and it threw me off the bed into the floor. And I'm like going, what happened? What happened? And she reached down, she goes, get back up here. So she pulls me back up. I start again, and she, and knocks me off the bed a second time. I'm like, whoa, what's happening here? And then she pulls me, and this time I grab a hold of her. And I hang on. And I guess evidently I gave her first orgasm.
Uh-huh.
And the other thing that happened for me was when I realized that she was having an orgasm, I had an orgasm. And that was, whoa, again, a real eye-opening, because I thought, hey, this is great. I mean, I wasn't being touched, or I mean, it was the act of that, me
Yeah.
able to give her pleasure gave me an enormous amount of pleasure, and I was like hooked immediately.
Yeah.
Because, whoa, this is so much better and much safer. And she, after we made love, she pulls me up to kiss me and says, I knew you were gay.
Ah,
And
ah,
I'm like, okay, well, and then she made me promise, don't tell anybody. And I said, okay, fine, don't tell anybody. And her best friend came and knocked on the door the next morning. They were going to go to class or whatever. And then I'm there, and her best friend goes, because I had moved back to the other bed, and then that was my next girlfriend, her best friend. But so I finally made it up to my room, got changed, and then headed down to the cafeteria. Yeah. And there were a bunch of us. We were theater nerds, so we were doing plays and hanging out with a bunch of kind of the hippie, nerdy, theater nerdy people, music people, and theater people. And when I walked into the lunchroom, several of them got up and started applauding. And I'm like, and they said, somebody finally got Mildred's cherry. Well done. Well done. And I looked at her and I said, I thought you said don't tell anybody. And she goes, well, it was, I just tell them. And evidently that triggered a lot of interest from other women, mostly I would really straight women. I somehow then had a reputation all of a sudden because it was a fairly small campus. I can't believe I was the only lesbian, but suddenly everybody knew. And I was getting a lot of inquiries from straight girls who were either mad at their boyfriends or broke up with their boyfriends or just wanted to dabble. And, and so I got lots of business.
Oh, that's so
And,
cool.
and from then on, I never had any problem getting a girlfriend. Thank you, Lord. And but it was a wonderful, heady time, and that realization of making love with her gave me pleasure, so much pleasure, and I was hooked. And a few times over the next few years, if I was really intoxicated and at a party with some guys and there was a guy there I always liked, I tried a time or two again with guys, once or twice a year for every other year, and then I just finally went, no, I think I'm right here. I'm right where I need to be. So I'm not a gold star lesbian, but I did do A and B. No, I'll stay here. Uh, so that was
Did you
wonderful.
continue seeing each other, the two of you?
No,
Or
I
was
broke
it
her
just that
heart.
one time?
No, oh yeah, we were dating. Yeah, she
Ah,
was in a sorority. She was in one of the Delta Sigma Theta, the woman of color sorority, and I used to love because she had her hair required a lot of attention. Um, Women of color would she straightened her hair, and was a lot of, and then I would wait for her to do that, and then I would pull her into bed and mess up her hair. She'd be like, I am late for my sorority meeting. That she'd have to put a bandana on her head and leave. And in fact, I stayed in her room so much that the dorm then needed to have what they called a fire escape buddy or whatever,
Uh-huh.
that in case there was an emergency. And they had to, and they called me and said, well, we need to hook you up with somebody, because they wanted to know, account for me, even though that wasn't my dorm well, that was my dorm, but it wasn't my room. But because I was in her room so often. So we stayed together for some time. And while I was with her, um, I decided I went to Los Angeles. I moved to LA with my, again, kind of my last, I was dwindling out the boys. And I met this guy from LA, from um, Beverly Hills. He had a Volvo and a beard.
He had a vulva?
A Volvo and a beard,
Oh,
and he was a really cool guy. So he was really very different from any of those West Tennessee boys.
mm,
Um, and he and I just hit it off. And he goes, you don't belong here. You need to. It's a small town. You need to get out of here. So he talked me into moving to, because he was going to go back. He came there because he had grandparents there, and he wanted to learn to be a farmer. And he turned into, he actually became a date farmer. He grew dates. But so I said, okay. And we took off to LA, and I was going to, go to school out there, but I didn't know anything about out-of-state tuition. And it was 1976 because Jimmy Carter was running for president. And the reason I know that is because his dad was some big wheel with the Republicans out there. And yes, he lived in Beverly Hills, 90210. I got the driver's license in Beverly Hills, and I was so proud. And he would ask me to always wear my overalls. We went down to Rodeo Drive, and he just kind of liked to do a FU to all the ostentatious, spending and consumerism of Beverly Hills, and trotted me out to go see fuck you. But I was loving it with the swimming pools and the palm trees and the opulence. I mean, these people were wealthy. And his sister, and who was nuts and amazing, and had amazing friends come over, people you've heard of, and go skinny dipping with. But he had me meet his dad, of course, because I lived in their house for the first few weeks I was there, till I got my own apartment and job and all that stuff. But his dad called me into his den, and there was this other old fart there, another old Republican who'd come down from Sacramento, and they're like, "We need to ask you some questions. Do you mind?" And I'm like, "Okay, cool." And he goes, "Well, we're hearing a lot about this Jimmy Carter fella, and we know you're from the South. So tell us what you think about this Jimmy Carter fella." And I'm like, I have no idea I never heard of Jimmy Carter. I'm from Tennessee, he's from Georgia, but they were very concerned, as they should be, about Jimmy Carter. And so I said, "I've never heard of the guy." And so he said, "So he's not politically strong in Tennessee, where you're from?" I said, "No, sir, never heard of him." And then I embellished the story to say, they said, "Do you think we need to worry about him?" And I went, "Oh, absolutely not." And so I am responsible for Jimmy Carter getting elected in 1976. You're welcome,
Right.
Jimmy.
She told them, don't worry about it, and they
I
didn't.
told those California Republicans, no need to worry.
That's great. Your first monumental political act.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I stayed out there and really hated LA. Too many people, too many cars, lots of crazy, crazy people. And I missed Mildred terribly, terribly. And came back home, and we had written torrid letters back and forth. Back that in the day, you mailed letters, to each other. And I had saved them all. And I had, when I came back, I just dumped all my stuff in my mom and dad's house, and of course headed back to the campus, and immediately began reconnecting with her and all my friends back there. And I was working at a Walmart, one of the early Walmarts, number 107, that had just moved across the Mississippi into Tennessee, West Tennessee. And my dad shows up and says, "You need to come home over the weekend. Mom and I need to talk to you. We're all serious." And I'm like, "Uh-oh." I said, "Is somebody sick? Is Kevin okay? My brother, is somebody dying? Is mom okay? Are you okay?" And he goes, "Just come home this weekend and at this particular time." And I get home, and they've sent my brother away. And I'm thinking, this is really bad news. And I come in, and mom comes out, and she's got a bunch of these letters in her hand that Mildred had written to me. And she was just shaking.
Yeah.
And she said, "I don't want that woman ever back in my house again. And how long has this been going on?" And she was sure that it was, Mildred that had lured me into this lesbian lifestyle, alternative lifestyle. And I said, I'm trying to go, "Mom, it was me." "Oh, no, no, no." And then my dad goes, "Was it Ann Dietzel, who was my piano teacher forever, who was what they called back then an old maid, kind of dykey gal?" But no. was my piano teacher. So that was a terrible, terrible night, because before it was over, Mom said to me, I would rather see you laying dead in a casket than to know this about you.
Oh gosh. Oh, well, that must have just cut you open.
And
Ah,
I was gutted by that, because I mean, I love my mother, we were close,
yeah.
but and that all came from her religious
Yep.
bias. And I said, okay, fine. I'm dead then. I'm dead to you. And
Ah,
years later, and I've talked about this a lot in therapy, obviously, but I punished us both. I wouldn't go home. I'd go home maybe at Christmas. And I shut her out. I shut my family out because of that. And it punished us both. You know, we lost a whole lot of time together that we could have had a relationship. Years later, we we came around, and she in fact became a good advocate for
mm,
me. Not a frontline kind of thing, but when the don't ask, don't tell thing was happening,
mhm,
um, later on, she at church again, there was a chaplain, so a military preacher had come to visit and speak. And this was around the time of the don't ask, don't tell. And so after he spoke, he was taking questions, and somebody said, what do you think about don't ask, don't tell? And he said, well, we have our churches and they have theirs. And, okay, fine. Like, I guess what was the MCC churches that were
yeah,
Christian churches that were gay
yeah,
um, friendly or gay organized. And he said that like us and them kind of thing. And
yeah.
my mom, God bless her, said, I don't think Jesus would be very happy with that.
Ah,
Yeah.
good mom.
I don't think Jesus would have treated them like that.
What do
Jesus,
you think brought about her change?
for one thing, me not changing, and
Yeah,
me being me, and you know,
that's what loved you.
and she loved me, and we had some years of estrangement there, so I think
Yeah.
she was ready to forgive and forget or move on anyway. And I remember also, it was tough because sometimes I'd bring home a different girl when I was this was, would come home, but um I was partnered with Keisha for many, many years, and I remember I knew this mom, we'd go home for Christmas and we'd have the gifts all wrapped, and I made a point that year to put from Lenny and Keisha,
Mm,
from all the gifts. And so we got there, we put them all under the tree because mom was a notorious snoop. She would
mm,
look under the tree to see what was there and what had been added to the new. So when we came in, there were a bunch of new gifts. Well, late after dinner, she sneaks back. She comes, she goes, I need to talk to you. And I said, what? What is it? And all the gifts said from Keisha and Lenny, from Lenny and Keisha. And so it was like Christmas Eve. And she
mm.
said, I I noticed that there are all these gifts under the tree from Keisha and you. And I said, yeah, okay. And she goes, well, I don't think I have anything under the tree for her. And I said, you need to fix that.
Ah, ah, ah,
She got in the car and went to
uh-huh.
Walgreens or Walmart, whatever, and Christmas morning, there were wrapped presents under the tree with Keisha's name.
Oh, excellent. But
Yeah.
there was nothing for the both of you together?
I don't really remember that.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
that's great, Lenny. For
right. But
you to
yeah,
fix that.
she came around, and I think she began to understand that first of all, I'm not changing, you
Yeah.
know. But and my brother came out when he grew up. And then I found out years later, I didn't know this, but my dad was a closet homosexual.
Oh my goodness.
And so that also gave me some insight as to her drastic reaction to finding out about me. I'm thinking, she's probably thinking, God, there's queers everywhere in this family. Oh my God, everybody's queer but me. And so I again, that was an insight because I didn't know about my dad
How
till
did you find out?
my brother told me when I was an adult that
How did he find out?
well, he's a gay man.
Yeah.
Okay, so once he got involved in the gay community in a little tiny town, it's a little tiny town, and
Uh, uh,
dad had a bit of a reputation, but he was
uh,
strictly on the down low because he was in the church,
yeah.
just deacon, fine, upstanding man, whatever. So he was on the DL, but in the community of the gay male community, I think it was known, obviously, but
Yeah.
they were protecting, they were very closeted then and
Yeah.
protected each other's secrets, but within their community, they talked about each other.
Right. Right. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so Kevin verified it for me, and then I started to kind of put together some things over the, things that comments that he'd made and things, and thought, now it makes sense. And remembered a trip home where Dad always went fishing. He was self-employed. He was a piano tuner. That's why I became self-employed. Love that. You get Fridays up, you get whenever off. But he and his dad would go fishing every Friday over at Reelfoot Lake, world's largest natural fish hatchery up there in Northwest. Beautiful lake.
Hmm.
And they kept an old boat down there. And so I loved to go fishing sometimes when I was home. And I was riding down there with Dad in the old car or truck, whatever. And there was some young women walking down the road as we passed. And I remember it never makes sense then, but Dad goes, "Well, there's some pretty girls here for you." And I'm like, okay. But I thought again, he did things to tell me, but he never came out to me until late in life. I don't remember when, but it would have been much later in life. He passed in 2012. Um, and I'm home and he's out in his little shop tinkering. He also did a lot of electronics and stuff again, putting some of that fix it thing. And we're out there and we're just talking a little bit, and I don't know who brought it up or what, but he said, I'm gay.
Ah, wow.
And I said, well, Dad, not officially until just now.
Oh, wow.
And he said, well, I figured you knew. And I just wanted to say, by the way, I'm gay.
Yeah.
And I said, well, thank you for telling me. And, I had said I'd had some suspicions. I'd heard some stories, but that was probably pretty close to him, you know, moving into some dementia and some stuff. So it was important for him to say that to me, I guess, at some point,
Yes.
and to come out. So I appreciated that very much. But
Oh,
back to so after I spent a little time in LA getting Jimmy Carter elected, um, and came home, and then my mom, we had that big falling out. I ended up in Birmingham. I was going to go to pharmacy school, and I'd already had a couple of years of undergrad, you know, psych major, whatever. And then I thought, I want to be a pharmacist, because if we can make drugs that heal bodies, why can't we make drugs that heal minds? I said, was my sort of my theorem. So I
yeah.
wanted to study pharmacology because I could see this whole, but obviously pharmacy school meant a lot of study and discipline. And I was still pretty young and liked to drink and chase girls. So
Yes.
I didn't do that. I did okay, but I wasn't making great grades. And they actually stuck me. I went, and there was a terrible winter storm down in Birmingham, which is unusual in Birmingham. And so I couldn't get down there ahead of time to get an off-campus apartment because I don't know, I was a little older, but I was still, so I got stuck in the freshman girls' dorm.
Oh, just your meat and potatoes,
I
honey.
just hate that.
Uh,
until they could get me, till I could get off campus housing. But there were, again, they had like curfew. I was like, what?
Remember that?
Sanford is a Baptist. At the time, it was affiliated with the Baptist church or the Presbyterian, some Christian church. So, but the freshman girls' dorm was a fun place to be. Uh,
Just that.
for an a young dyke. And I remember I had a picture of my girlfriend and my roommates. I had three of us per room. They each had little 5x7s of their boyfriend. I had like an 11x13 of Wanda, who was the girlfriend after Mildred, and that was a clue. But then I stayed out late. I missed curfew, so you know, they'd lock the gates. So I whatever, and I was doing a lot of drinking, and I wasn't making passes at anybody or anything like that. I had a girlfriend, but I was enjoying the view for sure. Young women around me. But at one time after I came in late or kind of snuck in, one of the dorm RA or whatever came and leaned in on me and said, you know, we really don't like you here and we just can't wait till you get out of here. And I'm like, me too. You know, and the only thing convenient about it is I get to walk to my class. But other than that, yeah, it was cramping my style for sure. But and she was like, well, we know all about you and you're coming in here late and drinking and you know, you're just we think you're a bad influence on these young women. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. Fuck you, really. But I mean, they were, you know, we're keeping our eye on you and kind of intimated that they knew I was gay. Okay, whatever. But you know, to try somebody to muscle me like that, I was like, that's not going to work. But okay, fine. I'm going to leave everybody alone and I'm going to get the hell out of here as soon as I can. So I wasn't that welcome, but I got my little apartment and was working at a bartending job and not doing my tech time with my pharmacy, because you have to have like an apprenticeship as a pharmacist. You got to work with a pharmacist and you get paid nothing. And you have to have that time. I just bought a new Ford F-150. I had to work. I was making good money as a bartender. And anyway, some point it all kind of came together. I'm like, you know what? I really don't think I want to be a pharmacist. You know, they never get laid. I mean, I was sure of that. That was motivation for everything. But I said, you hear about your priest, your preacher, your mailman, the doctor getting laid, having affairs, but you never hear about your pharmacist, do you? Never do. So I just sort of thought, screw it, I'm going to quit. And because they were pressuring me, you're going to have to do these intern hours. And I'm like, how am I going to, I mean, I already had, you know, I had a car payment and rent. I just was like, I can't make that work. So I decided that I was going to quit. And that night, my friend, my lab partner, who was named Molly Roberts, who was from England, Ireland, she had this accent. So I'm like kind of bemoaning, well, what do I do? I actually kind of just said, I quit. I was going to say, I'm going to drop out, go into my whoever advisor and say, I'm getting ready to drop out. I'm going to, you know, forget about it. And let's don't put any more money into this. And then also about that same night, right around that time, I had a big fight with my boss at the bar, the restaurant, Chinese restaurant, very popular. And I told him, screw you. And I quit. So then I'm like, well, that was really smart, you know? And we're sitting there listening to Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, getting really high. And Molly says, well, I said, I need a job. You know, I've just quit school. I've just quit my job. I need a job. And she said, well, my dad was talking about they're going to hire women for the very first time in the coal mine. And I go, wait, there's coal mines in Alabama? And she goes, oh, yeah, there's coal in Alabama. And her dad worked for Jim Walters Resources, which was the Jim Walters homes, the modular homes. Well, they evidently were a large company and they owned a lot of other interests, including mines with the mineral rights. So they owned coal mines. in several states, including Alabama. And her dad had come over from England, was a mining engineer. So he worked for Jim Walters. And she had heard him say that the federal government was forcing them to hire women. Nobody was doing it voluntarily, that's for sure.
Mhm.
And they were being forced to hire women, and they were going to bring in a class and weed them out, and then let that first group go in, because you had to have a little bit of a good bit of orientation before they actually let you go work in the coal mine. And so I remember distinctly her saying, and starting pay is going to be $7.45 an hour. And I think minimum wage then was probably maybe $2.50.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
it was a big raise, and I'm going,
Big.
ooh, now that'll take care of the truck payment. So I thought, I want this job. I mean, I had no idea what it meant. I just was listening to how much I was going to get paid.
Mhm.
So she set up a meeting with her dad, and I went and bought the best bottle of scotch I could find in Birmingham, Alabama, and went into his living room and sat down, gave him the scotch, and talked him into hiring me. And he was just like, you don't want to do this. This is a hard job. This is a dangerous job. Go back to school. And I'm going, no, no, no. I'm done with pharmacy, because his daughter was my lab mate. I'm like, I'm done with that. I'm moving on. I'm ready to consider some other career. And he goes, but not coal mining. Come on. Who thinks of that? Nobody. But I was thinking about $7.45.
Yep.
So I talked him into it. Then he said, okay, I make one request, because he said, I'm a company man. So basically for the first year, you're not earning us any money. We're teaching you how to be whatever, and you really don't generate any profit for us. We're just your worker bee for a minute. He said, will you commit to 1 year? And I said, I will. And so he pulled the strings, whatever. And I was in that first class of 13 women. We were the 13. I don't know why 13. I just thought that was interesting.
The company.
That got picked. That was the first class of women who, with whatever the United Mine Workers local there, and I can't remember the number there in Birmingham, but we were the first group to go into the deep mine. And these were deep mines, and it was about a quarter mile down, elevator down, ears popped several times. It was amazing place to work. And they were very hostile. They were very inhospitable. They were not happy.
Mhm.
And they were hostile and threatening and abusive, and um, they were bothered by us being there. And some of the women made boyfriends, and some of us didn't. I think in that group of 13, there were three, maybe four women of color. But I used to think when we came out, I said we were unirace and unisex, because
Yes.
we had the goggles and the hats and respirators sometimes, and then we were all wearing overalls and boots and gloves, and we were all covered in coal dust and filthy. And then and then we joked that some of those girls came in, they only had a little bit of dirt on their knees.
Uh-huh.
They were getting the good jobs. But I loved it, because it was so interesting. Because it was nothing like I'd ever done before. I kind of liked being down in the ground. It was really cool and scary and dangerous, but I that's where the seed was planted for my apprenticeship to be an electrician, because in the coal mine, because of the air,
Mhm.
no internal combustion engine, so no gasoline engine. Everything was electric. All the machinery was electric powered. So the electricians were gods. They ruled. They got all the overtime. They made all the money. They'd come in, something would shut down, and anytime shut down, there's no money. And these guys would come in and they would fix everything. And I was like, whoa, now there you go. They were the alphas for sure. And I was like, wow, if I'm going to be in the trades, which at that point I was beginning to consider because I'd never considered the trades.
Yeah.
And because it was that time where the trade unions were finally beginning to being forced to hire
Right.
and minorities.
Right.
And, the federal government had to make them do it,
That's
especially
right.
out, but I thought, well, shoot, if I'm going to, I knew I wasn't going to be a coal miner I figured I'd do my year and get the hell out of there. But being an electrician seemed very desirable because they were gods. I just was like,
Yeah.
man, they know how to fix everything. They make all the money. Yeah, they're cool. They're cool. And so I did write the song later, Blue Creek #3, some years later. But there was a woman there who was from Montgomery, no, Tuscaloosa. And she was this gorgeous little gal. And we did sneak off and turn our little lights off and kiss. That was really fun. But I had, even then I was still not a big old bulldagger. I was still kind of a kid and kind of scrawny and probably weighed 150 pounds maybe. And I had several fellows come and lean in on me pretty hard and try to push me around and threaten me physically, threaten me sexually. Of course, they said all kinds of horrible shit to us. I mean, all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
That really did. I realized that again, I kind of understood that whole alpha thing and just understood that I have to be bigger and better than they are and not be afraid and not show fear. There's 12 other women you can fuck with down here. Leave me alone. But
Mhm.
yeah. And so I did that. I didn't quite make the year. Um, I had witnessed a couple of accidents, and
Tell
this
about that.
there was a guy who had a heart attack, an older fellow who had a heart attack, and we had all been taught with CPR and all that kind of thing. And I remember thinking, oh God, that's going to be hard because I knew the old guy chewed tobacco, and I was already not looking forward to doing because
Right.
back then you did the compressions and then you do some breaths and then the
Yeah.
compressions and so I'm thinking, oh God, he's got tobacco. So we're like, make sure get the tobacco. But it was the foreman or whoever was down there was so freaked out. He continued to do CPR for way longer than you're supposed to. You become ineffective. You're supposed to tag team out. And there were several of us around going, let us come in. No, no. He just kept going and he sweat pouring off him. And we were just freaked out. Like, you're not being effective anymore. You need to let one of us rotate out. He wouldn't do it. And that really upset me. The man did not survive.
Mm.
And I felt really bad because it was like, we were all standing there. We could have helped him,
Yeah.
but the boss said no. And then the incident that I refer to in the song,
Yeah.
the coal mine was a very dangerous place. And we had to constantly be pinning the ceiling and putting timbers to hold up because we were cutting these giant tunnels out of the middle of the earth. So there was a lot of gravity, there was a lot of weight. So we were constantly putting these huge girders that they call pinning the ceiling, these big U-shaped steel channels that were 10 feet long, 20, and then 4 or 5 feet wide that they drill and stick these pins and then we were putting up actual wooden timbers that we'd cut to size and then run curtains around to move the air. And so, and one time I'd notice like most of it, the area we could actually stand up in and walk, and occasionally would get narrow, but mostly they had these giant machines that would cut out these huge swaths, continuous miner it was called. So it was but it was a tunnel.
Mm.
And there were 4 of them. There was a constantly working thing that moved. They would move the rail forward and the belts forward. And it was a constantly evolving, moving thing that was growing exponentially every shift. And I can remember coming in sometime where it had been this kind of low place. And then suddenly I walked in and there was this, it was like a huge room.
Mm.
And I go, wow. And they said, yeah, last night the ceiling fell in. So that was the line. I said, it was a huge cathedral where once there was a narrow hall.
Yeah.
And so we were aware of that kind of thing. And so the night in the song was a young man who was a young foreman. I remember he was a redheaded kid. He was moving some gear from the train, or the man train that brought in equipment, and then they were setting up a come along hoist that they hooked up to one of these channels that we had installed. And this was in an older part. So they were picking stuff off of the end of that tram to then get it off and then set it on the ground. And when they did that, the channel buckled from the weight that they were picking up. They shouldn't have used that. And a big flat slab of, I don't know, material, rock, slid off and hit him on the back of the head. He, of course, had on a hard hat, but
Yeah.
yeah. And I just happened to be walking back to where we kept our lunch to get to my lunchbox, to get to my thermos or whatever. And they were all down there flashing because we all wear lights on our helmets because we had to make our own light. They were doing this whole little come now, hurry, hurry, trouble, trouble indication. And I went running down there. And of course, he's laying on the ground, pretty injured. And the guy goes, "You're a girl, comfort him." And so,
Oh,
"You're a woman, comfort him." And so I got down on, crisscross and held his head in my lap because we were having to wait for the man bus, this one to move out and another. So it took 20 to 30 minutes to get from the top down. I mean, it was well spread out. So in that time, I'm holding his head, saying comforting things to him, telling him it's going to be okay. We're hunting up towels or t-shirts or whatever to wrap around his head. What's this side? Well, anyway. You're going to be okay. I was freaked the fuck out. But I just sort of, adrenaline, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And then I rode out with him. Again, they didn't want to move him around a lot. So we all kind of got up together. We got on the thing and then we rode out. And then once we were up, there was an ambulance waiting and they took him in, and he did not survive either. It was
oh,
young, and it had a young wife and some couple of young children. But in the song, I indicate that was my last night there.
yeah,
Um, and I also said there were more than one in the song. I said those boys, but it
yeah.
was just the one guy. And then it was a few weeks later that I had rotated off to another group, the what do they call it, the belt crew, where we had these giant rollers. And anyway, we're throwing stuff through and it hit and it bounced back and hit me on the inside of my leg, and I had a big cut. So I ended up in the emergency room that night getting some stitches. And that was the night I came back and said, fuck this. And we had chains with our baskets with our clothing that we would take up into the ceiling and then put a padlock on it because they wanted to keep it up. It was, couldn't steal it. We had the women's locker room. They just sort of, I don't know, I'd never seen, but so I remember bringing the chain down with my basket with my street clothes because we'd have to shower, of course, there before we could go
Yeah.
home. And I showered up and I went home, and then I guess the next day I called Molly's dad and said, I'm not going back. And, and it was because of not so much the heart attack, but the other guy getting hurt like that. And then my own injury. And I just like, this is
Yeah.
nuts. This is nuts. I made it about 8 months, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just said, look, I'm sorry. I told you I was going to do a year, but you were right. I
Yeah.
don't I don't, this is not a job I want to do. And
Well,
right after that, I moved back to Nashville. I'd had enough of Alabama too. I never really liked Alabama much because I always said the queer community felt, they always felt like they were third class citizens, like they considered themselves to be third class citizens because there was so much homophobia and there was a lot of internalized homophobia in the community,
mhm,
a lot of misogyny. And I remember being very aware of the pecking order of the community. And of course, it's the Deep South, and this was in the 70s, the late 70s.
yeah,
And so it was white men, white heterosexual men, and then white, I don't know, it was hard to know where the gay men, because the women, white women somewhere, and then a gay, so still had the men at the top, even straight or maybe gay, but not out. Then white women, and then then white lesbians, and then the women of the black lesbians were the bottom rung
yeah,
food chain. And they seemed to be real unhappy. There were a lot of real unhappy people there in the community. It was all, of course, very much of a bar culture and drinking and bar, and there was a lot of drag stuff going on. It was the 70s, thank God there was disco.
yeah.
But it was a depressed community, of the queer community in Birmingham seemed very depressed. So I'd had enough. I'm from Tennessee. You can keep Alabama. But
Yes.
I went back to Nashville, and then that's when I started my apprenticeship with the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and I love getting those letters, dear sir and brother.
Now, how did you get into that? Because my impression was that the unions were pretty tight and it was hard to get in, even if you were a man, but especially if you were a woman.
Well, once again, federal government, they
Oh,
were
yeah.
they were short-sighted. So yeah, I was in the Nashville Local 429, and Nashville had a good size union there. Trade unions weren't very strong in the South at all, anyway, in the 70s. There was some TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, was
Yeah.
building some nukes and some
Yep.
power.
I worked on that.
Yep, you knew that. And they organized. So the trade unions were organized, but they weren't very strong like
Mm,
they were North. Hell, Georgia's a right to work state. They can't force you to join a union. Tennessee was a little different, but still, the unions weren't that strong. But I knew I'm ready to be an electrician. And in fact, I went to the IBEW and asked about getting in, and they had already picked their class because they were only going to pick the minimum required. And the reason they had to was because their joint apprenticeship and training committees programs had started taking federal money to help subsidize
mhm,
their apprenticeship programs. And
mhm.
then after a few years of that, then the federal government said, okay, you're taking our money now. Where are your women and minorities? And they,
Right.
oh, we don't have any. Well, then if you want to keep getting this federal money, you
Yep.
better bring in some different people. So
Yep.
they began to actively recruit women and minorities, late 70s, because they had to.
Yep.
And so I went to the IBEW and they said, no, sorry, we're full. And in fact, there was this giant building, we called it the Roundhouse there in Nashville, where many trades had their offices, including the pipe fitters, the plumbers, the electrical workers, carpenters were all kind of in this building. So after I go in there and they tell me, nah, I'm walking out and this guy comes out of his office. He said, hey, are you trying to get an apprenticeship program? I said, yes, sir. I'm trying to get in the electrical union 429. He says, oh, hell, you don't want to be an electrician. Come on in here. And he was with the pipe fitters, local steam fitters, pipe fitters. And he was like, oh yeah, we need some women. Okay, cool. So I started the whole application process with him,
Ah,
which included, some health checks and some aptitude tests where you put slot A and
yep.
tab
Yep.
B. And I had to have, a certain high school math and algebra. I'm like, dude, I've been in pharmacy school, but okay, no problem.
Yep.
Uh, and went through,
General aptitude test battery. I
there
took
you
it too.
I went through all that shit. And then for that summer, I actually went to work for a non-union electrical contractor just to get my feet wet.